Hello, good to welcome you back to another episode of ideasSpace with the Urban Design Group, Urban Nous, and me, Christopher Martin. It's a really important time to be working in the built environment, and I'm hoping that with these conversations, we can share ideas to collectively shape better cities and societies around the world. And with this, perhaps the most impactful improvement to public life we can make in cities is to give more space to people on the streets, to people walking and relaxing, because this leads to more social cities, and I would argue a more accepting society. And at the root of this is designing cities in such a way as to encourage us to spend more time in a public forum, because this increases the opportunity we have for social interaction, for exchange, for spontaneity in city life. And at the heart of this is balancing movement and place. Finding the right balance is what we're discussing today. And it's great to be talking with Robert Martin, no relation, Head of Mobility and Architects at JAJA Architects. Robert, great to have you with us. And I want to ask you first if you can sort of just explore with us and tell us a bit more about your really engaging theory about a mobility pyramid or a mobility diet.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. And thank you for having me and the Urban Design Group. It's a real pleasure to be able to share JAJA's work with you today. To give you some context to our work, I thought I'd just step you through some of the thinking behind the mobility pyramid and how we kind of ended up at that kind of point. For those of you that don't know JAJA Architects, we're a small architecture and urban design studio based in Copenhagen, Denmark. And when a lot of people around the world think of Copenhagen, they think of the city of cyclists. It really is one of the cycling capitals of the world, with a very high modal share of cycling, as well as dedicated infrastructure and a separated bicycle network that would make most planning departments around the world jealous. That said, Copenhagen actually faces becoming a car-centric city once again. We're actually seeing a huge rise in the number of cars owned within the city. As you can see in this graph, over the past 20 years, there's been about a 30% increase of cars within the city. And you can see by this little dotted line in the bottom that it's actually exceeding the population growth in the city. And it's really tied to, say, city policies of attracting tax revenue generating families who have a lot of disposable income back to the city. And that's actually giving rise to quite a strange phenomenon in the city. It's the rise of the weekend car, where what they found is that 1 in 4 cars within the city actually don't move Monday to Friday. It just kind of sits still and then is used for recreation on the weekend, to get out into nature, or there's quite a strong, say, summer house culture within Copenhagen. And that 1 in 4 isn't taking into account the car that might move once, right? Which is a huge waste of space. And it means that even in one of the cycling capitals of the world, this is the kind of experience when people step outside their front door. It's kind of a litter of cars, where the amount of cars in the city actually exceeds the amount of available parking places. So you often find cars parked all over the place. And what you can see in this particular image, in a street that wasn't designed to accommodate that many cars, is that the city have actually had to take half of the sidewalk away to repurpose for car use, leaving pedestrians to kind of navigate this tiny part to the side. Whereas we at JAJA, sorry, one extra. We at JAJA think that if we start to rethink the way that we move around the cities and the kind of hierarchy of modes and the way we place them in the built environment, we can start to create much more, say, healthy and livable urban environments, where a lot of that space can be used for, say, social cohesion or green infrastructure to protect against climate change or upgrading of the building stock. And the kind of particular themes that JAJA are picking up on is this seemingly paradigm change in the way that we move around cities, right? So this in some ways is connected to advancements in automated, connected, electric and shared types of vehicles, but also the rapid emergence of micromobility. So that kind of tying of lightweight electric vehicles with battery electric propulsion. And most importantly for us, it's this changing way in which we access mobility through digital networks, right? So we're moving from this idea of owning a vehicle to accessing mobility, much like how we now access TV through subscription services like Netflix, music through Spotify, or kind of different forms of hotels through Airbnb. And where we get really excited about this, and we see a massive, potential for cities, is this completely changing of the way that, or like the relationship to vehicles. So this is, say, like the traditional way that we might move through cities, right? This particular graph is a distribution of trips with the distance at the bottom, showing that the majority of the trips is, say, under 10 kilometers, and the longer the distance the trip goes, the less often they happen. And when we have, say, kind of car-dominated systems, we use that vehicle for every type of trip, no matter if it's only a 200-meter trip down the road or a 100-kilometer trip across the country, right? And that's incredibly inefficient to use like a 5-seater, 2-ton car to go pick up shopping by yourself. Whereas what we're doing with these kind of access forms of transport, we can start to match the vehicle type to the journey type. So when we're no longer locked into any one vehicle, we can really be more efficient with our transportation systems and match the vehicles to the journey type. And ultimately, this is where we've ended up with our mobility pyramid, because all those kind of ideas that I presented to you along the way are somewhat complicated to kind of talk to the everyday person about why they should limit their car use. And furthermore, discussions on car freeness are very, say, black and white. They're very divided. I think if someone say a city has an ingrained car culture, even mentioning the idea car free is going to turn away a lot of people. And so what we did is we actually looked to say climate change activists or those working in health industries to see what they were doing to create an impact in their fields. And we were really inspired by these ideas of, say, meat-free Mondays as a way to reduce eating meat. It wasn't that everyone needed to go vegan overnight, but looking at ways to reduce our impact in say, food production. And so anyway, this is where we've been quite literal with this idea of a mobility pyramid, where we've tried to, in quite a fun way, look at a way of communicating about how people can best move away our cities. So it's never this idea that we're forcing people to give up their car, but maybe thinking like, okay, this journey is more suited to a bike, or maybe I can drop the kids off with a cargo bike, and if I do need to visit my summer house on the weekend, I can take a share car. But yeah, I guess that's kind of an introduction to the thinking that we have with this idea of the mobility pyramid.
I think it's a really great way to communicate the benefits of a better balance between movement and place, as I see it. So thanks for sort of laying it out, and I'm sure we'll end up talking a little bit more about it in a second. I think one thing that strikes me is kind of embedded in the culture of traditional transport planning with short sleeve white shirts as a stereotype in the UK is a kind of predict and provide approach to mobility management. And it's a really outdated approach, sort of based on the assumption that sort of predicted traffic growth has to be provided for at all costs. And that inevitably results in more congestion and really loses sight of the opportunities I think you've outlined in terms of creating the places we want, never mind need, with some of the crises you've highlighted. And I think your approach and your work at JAJA, from my understanding, works with an approach around backcasting and prototyping to counteract this, which I've heard about. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a bit more about this and why you think it creates better places.
Yeah, great question. And I'm glad that you brought up the kind of term predict and provide, because I guess moving on from predict and provide is this idea of decide and provide, right? Where you can see a lot of like planners are really trying to adopt that way of thinking, which is quite which is quite cool. And so I wouldn't say that our methodology is, say, novel individually, but I think it's the way that we combine the two, which is providing quite a lot of insights for us. And so just to explain the idea of backcasting, it's the opposite of forecasting, which I think a lot of people know is where people basically try and guess the future and then plan accordingly. Whereas what backcasting does is that you try and create a vision for a future that you want, and then you work your way backwards to get it. Prototyping complements this process, where we take elements of that vision of the future and we play them out in today. So we create small little projects over temporary amounts of time, and that the knowledge that we can get, the experience, the way that users interact with it, kind of balances the process so that backcasting kind of gives us the vision that we want to walk towards. And prototyping gives us the experience and knowledge. In some ways, it works like a hermeneutic circle, where our vision for the future kind of guides our work today, but our work today is constantly influencing that vision for the future.
Yeah, it's a really nice way of looking at it, and I think that's a really clear message in terms of we have to sort of establish the vision we want. We have to establish what we want to achieve from the really valuable spaces in our streets and public spaces, and actually then work backwards in terms of how do we get there, rather than having it diluted at every step. And I think I could actually like give you an example of how this process works, because I think it becomes a little bit clearer. So the team that I run, we're kind of involved with both real projects, but also a lot of research. And so to give you an example of the backcasting is that we've been working on this idea for a car-free city within Copenhagen, where we've done a lot of participation and workshops with the municipality, different user groups, as well as different mobility providers to kind of sketch out this future Copenhagen where cars are very much taken away from the built environment. And we've illustrated this through different forms of architectural drawings, visualizations, diagrams, in order to talk to people about it. And so that would be the kind of backcasting, where we then talk about what kind of policies do we need in order to get to it. But then what we're doing on the other side is this, say, a pilot project in a street of Copenhagen, where we're planning to take away 70% of all the parking. And in exchange for taking away 70% of the parking, we provide the residents of that street with a mobility package, because the street is very nicely located next to a metro station. There's lots of bus lanes there. And so we would provide car sharing as kind of like a mobility as a service package, to include also hire of cargo bikes, scooters, travel on the public transportation systems. And by taking away or using that 70% of parking to provide upgrading the built environment with more trees, places for people to come together. That image that I actually showed earlier was from that project. Yeah, so that would be an example, and the kind of learning that we can get from that pilot project will then let us decide, okay, these kind of visions of a future Copenhagen, which are green and have lots of trees everywhere, is this actually what the residents want, or do they want other amenities that would be better suited for this future Copenhagen? And I think that's like a nice little illustration about how we're using this methodology together in order to kind of work to create a more sustainable transportation system in Copenhagen. Brilliant. I'm glad it's not just United Kingdom, when every conversation really always revolves around parking, because that's on every project. It
always does. It always does.
You can't avoid it. And I think the idea of talking to people about the streets in that way is really interesting for me, because I think when we speak to people on about their streets as part of projects, I think it's that understanding that people want different things from their street at different times of the day, never mind the year, and at different times of their lives, of course. And that's why the job is so complex, but also so interesting. And I think one of the ideas around prototyping that I've read in your work And you've been looking at sort of trying to build in some of this flexibility through what you call a dynamic street profile. And I was wondering if you can just tell us a bit more about that kind of approach to your work, and that approach to designing in flexibility.
Yeah, sure. So that project, the dynamic street profile, is another example of one of these prototypes, right? Where in terms of that vision of the future, we anticipate much more connected built environments, where there's much more embedded sensors, and we can be much more flexible with the space. But it would also take a huge amount of resources and time to kind of dig up street networks to kind of get to this point. So what we've been looking at is a way to try and test how these kind of embedded sensors might work, and the kind of idea behind it basically is that in Copenhagen we have maybe a bit of an uncommon problem where we actually have bicycle congestion because we have too many bikes in sometimes too narrower cycle lanes. And especially now that there's been the adoption of cargo bikes and larger form factor vehicles on those cycle paths, it's becoming more and more congested. But at the same time, Copenhagen, certainly elements of it are medieval. So we kind of have like a fixed urban fabric that doesn't just allow us to create these ideal street widths where we kind of provide enough space for everyone. So the idea with this project that we've been doing is how can we say combine different physical elements, but through digital kind of infrastructures. And what we've primarily been looking at with the pilot project is how to integrate a bus stop into a bicycle path, because at the moment both user groups kind of suffer, where the cycle lane is kind of cramped because there's not enough room in the street, but also passengers of buses, when they're alighting or getting on, kind of have to jump through a cycle path.
This is talking especially about the sort of the very sort of Copenhagen or Danish typology where you sort of alight the bus onto a cycle track, isn't it? We've got a few of them here, but yeah, exactly.
And I mean, legally cyclists are supposed to stop, but I mean, it doesn't necessarily happen. And so the idea is that we've embedded these LED lights, which form this kind of protected zone onto an expanded bicycle path. So the bicycle path still allows cyclists to go through, but you kind of create this kind of buffered area where the bus passengers can alight safely. And I can imagine everyone's listening to this thinking that there's going to be lots of problems, right? And that's exactly why we're kind of trying to test it to see if this is a feasible way to proceed.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, working with technology like that as well really helps us in the future to imagine a situation where we can provide better for blind and partially sighted users as well, because that's certainly in the UK it's a concern for us and something we work with all the time, and I'm sure it's the same with you guys, with the idea of how can we actually use technology to improve the conditions for blind and partially sighted users. And this sounds like a really good way of making those situations better. So that sounds really compelling. I think that the other strand I wanted to explore with you is the sort of quite a popular term now, but unbundling the car. I think we all know that sort of every car now is basically only occupied by about 1.2 passengers or something like that, and is used very small amount of the time. And that's even connected to the idea you say that car ownership is growing in Copenhagen, but very much just for those kind of summer house trips. I think I always like to start from a sort of theoretical perspective that sort of mobility in cities, first and foremost, has to be a sort of servant to quality of life. And it sounds like you really come from that same sort of thinking as well. And I just wanted to explore with you some of the sort of strategies that are in place in Denmark, first of all, but also that you sort of embed in your approach to minimize the negative impact of cars on people's lives and the city as a whole. So I suppose exploring some more of the mobility packages that you've spoken around and alluded to, and just think about what are the strategies that you found most successful, and what can we steal from you?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you that the kind of mobility systems in place in the city do give rise to a certain way of living. And you can certainly see that here in Copenhagen, where because everything is on bicycle, much more people are much more free to move around. So you see people much more fluid with where they are. There's always people on the street when, I mean, even in the middle of winter, people cycling, but certainly in summer, everything explodes because, you know, you don't have to find parking. You don't have to worry about drink driving as much. You know, people can kind of just get out and enjoy. But what I would say in terms of strategies is that this has been happening for a long time. So there are kind of strategies that have been put in place 20 years ago, building on a culture which is 100 years ago. And then now we are also developing new strategies for, say, how to limit car use. And I think that some of the thinking around new urban developments is quite interesting. You can certainly see in Copenhagen and in some of the urban developments that we work on in other parts of Scandinavia and Northern Europe, there's this tendency to completely remove on-street parking. And you kind of consolidate all parking into parking houses, or we're trying to develop these typologies as mobility hubs. And what that does is it frees the street from permanently parked cars. You can still allow car access so that people can get to their home with a car, or for those that need a car, they still can move around the area. But it kind of, you don't have that same impact. And what they've actually done is they've used parking as a business within these areas, but they're not making enough money, because now that people have to walk 5 minutes to get their car, it's not quite as practical to own. And these car parks are just not full. And that's been an incredibly successful strategy, I would say, but that's only really in the new urban developments. I think it's a little bit different in existing urban fabrics, because the car parking is already there, and it's already, it's like very hard to take it when someone's already got it. But what I would say that Copenhagen and what the Copenhagen municipality and what we try and work with as well is there's an approach to how to best remove those car parking spaces. So one strategy is building dedicated car sharing spots to try and develop that culture of car share, which I think very much could answer that idea of the weekend car. It seems perfect if they can sort out the logistics of the system. And the other strategy which is happening right now is the city has actually undergone a pilot project where they basically put trees and benches in a lot of places around the city center, and it's amazing to see how much of a difference that has made. You see kind of cafes spilling out onto the street. You see people just like hanging around. It's no longer these corridors for cars, but the entire environment and atmosphere has changed. And that will only be a 3-month project, but I think that certainly, if not all of it, a lot of elements of it will carry forward. And I'm very excited to see what happens next.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, it comes back to that idea you spoke about at the beginning of sort of just incentivizing. And I think I always like reading the annual Copenhagen bike report. And it's that one thing about why do people cycle in Copenhagen, and sort of overwhelmingly because it's easy. And I think that really speaks to that idea you've mentioned there around the parking issue, first of all, and also around sort of using streets for different things, or the streets and trees. That's really compelling, I think. I always really hate to cut these conversations short, but I'm afraid that's all the time we've got. But just, you mentioned the parking house there, and I also, we didn't get a chance to speak around the parking house, but I think probably the most Instagrammed piece of urbanism in the last year, the old parking house. So I'd urge everyone to check it out and sort of inspiration to how to transform parking garages and parking houses around the world. But I just want to thank you again, Robert, and I'm really looking forward to speaking again. I also want to thank everyone else who's listening into this as well. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of IdeasSpace with the Urban Design Group, Urban Nous, and me, Christopher Martin. More episodes coming your way, so do please get in touch if you have any questions, and sign up to the Urban Design Group Urban Update to catch every conversation. Thanks again, Robert.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.